Hi, welcome to Transforming Narratives to Create Racial and Health Equity. My name is Erica Burrows Girardi. I am the Senior Outreach Specialist with County Health Rankings and Roadmaps. This webinar is the second in a now three-part webinar series called Advancing Racial Equity. Hopefully you've already seen part one of the series, which was called Declaring Racism as a Public Health Crisis. Selma is chatting the link to that series description, and so you can retrieve a link to watch that webinar on demand. And later, I'm going to share with you why we have decided to extend this series, and I'm going to share who will round out our guest panel for the conclusion of this series. Today, I'm joined by colleagues that will help facilitate your learning experience. I want to start by introducing who's chatting to you. Her name is Selma Ali, and she is a community coach with the co-producer of this series, Mobilizing Action Toward Community Health, which we call MATCH because Selma, you know, in public health, we have to have acronyms, right?
All the acronyms, and the longer, the better. Hey everyone, my name is Selma Ali, and welcome to the webinar. We're really excited at MATCH to be co-producing this with CHR&R. As Erica mentioned, I will be interacting with y'all in the chat, so feel free to chat us up whenever you want. However, just to let y'all know, place any questions you may have in the Q&A box, where Joanne Lee with Healthy Places by Design will meet you to respond. Hey, Joanne.
Hey, Selma, thanks so much for pointing everybody to the Q&A box. So folks, as you heard, if you don't want your question to be missed, make sure you use the Q&A box for any questions for our presenters today. And just note that you don't need to wait until we get to the Q&A section, but as questions come to mind, please go ahead and put them in the Q&A, and I'll be recording them in order. Just so you know, folks, today's webinar is just packed with a lot of great information and sharing of perspectives. So we may not have a lot of time for Q&A, but we'll get to as many questions as we can. And Erica's going to tell you about an opportunity to get more of your questions answered after the webinar. But for now, I'm really glad to be here from Healthy Places by Design as a longtime partner with CHR&R. And I want to introduce you all to James Lloyd. He works a lot of the magic behind these webinars as our technology support person. James?
Thank you so much, Joanne. As Joanne mentioned, I'm with County Health Rankings and Roadmaps in the Program Technology Coordination, and I'll be watching the chat today to see if anybody's having technical issues, and I'll do my best to do what I can to help solve them. I'm so honored to be able to participate in this really worthwhile subject. And with that, Erica, I'll hand it back to you.
Thank you so much, James, and thanks to Selma and Joanne as well for being a part of this production. I am just thrilled to be able to introduce you to our amazing guests today. And I want to start with T. Gonzales, who is the director of the Center for Health Equity at the Louisville Metro Department of Public Health and Wellness. So hi, T. Thank you for joining us.
Good afternoon. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. And next, I want to introduce you to Jonathan Heller. Jonathan is a Senior Health Equity Fellow with the University of Wisconsin Population Health Institute. And Jonathan might be familiar to some of you because he is a co-founder of Human Impact Partners, but I'm excited to say that now he's part of the UW-PHI family. Hi, Jonathan.
Thanks, Erica. Thanks so much for having me, and thanks for the kind words. Looking forward to this.
Of course, and rounding out today's panel is Paula Trans, who is the director of MATCH. Hi, Paula.
Hi there, really thrilled to be here.
Thank you all so much. And these folks that are on today's panel have incredible biographies and resumes. We have actually included their bios for you to read later in your resource guide. So you will get that resource guide tomorrow, and you can read a lot more about their history and their work. So let's kind of dig back into what it is that we're going to be learning about today. By the end of our time, today, our goal is to answer these questions for you. What are narratives and how are they created? That's a question that's always circled in my mind when I heard the word narrative. And I think some of you will agree with me that it's a word that's kind of used a lot today. So today we're going to actually get a clear definition of what narratives are. We're also going to talk about how racism can influence those narratives and how can we transform them so that they are more inclusive. I know that there are some of you who are in our audience today that are familiar with county health rankings and roadmaps, but we do have some new people who have been joining us for this series. So I want to take a moment just to tell everybody a little bit about us. County Health Rankings and Roadmaps is located at the University of Wisconsin Population Health Institute. We have several partners, including the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, and as Joanna said earlier, also Healthy Places by Design is one of our long-term partners. CHR&R, as we call ourselves, is committed to improving health outcomes for everyone. Evidence shows that a society cannot improve health outcomes for all without a commitment to equity. Therefore, we're very much committed to advancing equity because everyone has a right to thrive, no matter their zip code, no matter the color of their skin, age, or any other aspect that makes us unique. Here at CHR&R, we provide data, evidence, guidance, and stories to help you create change. For more information about our work, I want to encourage you to watch our 2021 CHR 101 webinar. And this webinar will give you an overview about who we are, what it is that we do, the tools and resources that we can provide to you that can help you advance your work. A link to that webinar will be included in your resource guide. And now I'm going to ask Selma to back to the stage and unmute to tell you all about MATCH.
Hey everyone, we've used the acronym MATCH a lot. MATCH stands for the Mobilizing Action Towards Community Health, and our research and work focuses on health equity, collective community action, health in all policies, power building, and organizational policy and systems change. Through a field building approach, MATCH works with partners to evolve practice, focus priorities, and shift power to enhance collective action on root causes of health and equity through 3 strategic areas, as you see on your screen. We do that through training, engaged research and development, and also alignment across the state. Thank y'all again for having us.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you are the perfect partners for this Advancing Racial Equity series. And we here at County Health Rankings and Roadmaps certainly thank you for your contribution to this series. As Joanne shared with you earlier, we do have another opportunity for you to unpack what you're going to be learning today, because it's a lot of information, but it's also information that might be new to you. So we are pleased to share that there will be an opportunity for you to discuss and process what is being said today, because we're going to hold an interactive discussion group to deepen your learning after the webinar. Some of you've been on these discussion groups before, so you know what they're like. These conversations give you a chance to be face-to-face with other webinar attendees and share what you are doing locally, as well as ask questions of other participants. And we are pleased to offer these sessions in partnership with Healthy Places by Design. And Joanne will be joining us in those at the discussion group, because she's going to facilitate it. Jonathan, Paula, and T will also be joining us as well. If you do not have anything else on your calendar, consider joining us in that discussion group right after the webinar. And Selma is going to chat some information about the discussion group after toward the end of the webinar. Let's talk about why we are even having this series, like what's at the heart of it, and that's racism. Racism has had a pronounced effect, limiting opportunities for good health for those who experience it. According to Dr. Anthony Fauci, who made this statement last month, we simply can't ignore the effects of racism anymore. Like no more sweeping it under the rug, no more avoiding conversations that make us uncomfortable. If we truly care about everyone's health, we must be courageous enough to address the undeniable. We must be courageous enough to challenge status quo thinking and challenge status quo solutions. Last month, our Declaring Racism as a Public Health Crisis webinar was a milestone for us. It was the first time ever that we had max capacity with 1,000 participants. And I'm not saying that to brag. I'm saying that to thank you. CHR&R and Match, thank you for joining us and taking courageous steps to dig into racism and how it impacts health, as well as solutions that can undo the harm that it's caused. And here is the county health rankings model, which displays multiple factors that influence health. You'll notice there are 4 buckets which we organize these multiple factors. Racism can be interpersonal or structural. Structural is sometimes called institutional racism. What's important to know is that evidence shows that racism limits opportunity in all 4 of those buckets, but it also affects the health of our entire nation. So we have to take steps to undo the harm that it's caused. So just before I invite Jonathan back to the mic, I want to tell you about what you might see me doing today. Someone was actually chatting a link to a blog that we posted on May 27th. And now during the May webinar, if you were with us, you saw me snapping my fingers when speakers courageously engaged us in a dialogue about racism. Snapping is simply a way of communicating to the speaker that what they're saying resonates with me. The blog that I'm going to ask you to read later actually shares the meaning behind snapping. And I do encourage you to read it, but in the meantime, I invite you in joining me in snapping your fingers, because I promise you that our speakers this month are just as compelling as the speakers that we had from the last month's webinar. And with that, Jonathan, I'm going to ask you to unmute, because I want to ask you this question. I want to just kind of dig right in. I shared with people earlier that narrative is a word that we hear often in dialogues today. I'm not going to say it's overused, but I'm not sure if there's a shared understanding of what it really is. So before we really get into a conversation about transforming narrative, can you tell us exactly what a narrative is?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Erica. And I totally agree. Narrative is a word that has many, many meanings these days. I'm going to use it in a very specific way. For me, narratives are values-based meta-stories about how and why the world operates that have the ability to shape public consciousness, including our collective senses of responsibility and possibility. So let me break that down a bit. By meta stories, I mean that they're not individual stories, but rather groupings of stories with a theme. And one analogy that I really like is that if you think about stars in the sky as being the stories, narratives are the constellations. They're an interpretation of the individual stories when we view them as a group. So in my view, narratives are a form of power. They have a huge influence on what structural and policy changes are possible. And a particular set of narratives are dominant at any one time. And by that, I mean that they're held by many people. They're omnipresent and insidious. They're in our heads, they're in our actions without us ever being aware that they are. They're embedded in our institutions, in our structures, and in our norms. They're more powerful than facts. In fact, if we as public health folks present a set of facts to people and they don't align with their worldviews and their narratives, they're going to dismiss those facts. And then these narratives also are drawn from a subset of the values and beliefs that people hold broadly. So it's just a particular set of them at any one time are dominant. And they're dominant, they're created and advanced and maintained by people for a specific purpose. And so that also means that they are changeable.
Right. And can you give us an example of a current dominant narrative in a specific policy area that affects health equity and describe how that narrative is shifting?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to focus on policing, which I'm sure you'd all agree is clearly a racial equity issue. And it's also a health equity issue because we as a society have been choosing to punish and incarcerate people rather than address their underlying problems like drug addiction and mental health issues that we know are actually public health issues. So up until 5 or 6 years ago, the dominant narratives around policing and criminal justice focused on themes like law and order. They were fear-based. We should always be afraid. Crime is always rising. And certain people, mostly Black men, were seen as threats. Politicians were competing to see who could be the toughest on crime. And that led to a bunch of laws like punishing drug use, especially crack use, 3 strikes laws, anti-gang laws, and many, many other really harsh punishments. Anyone who didn't toe the line on that was labeled soft on crime, and those folks generally couldn't win elections. And in that environment, in that narrative environment, systems and policy change around policing was impossible. And folks were really just blind to the injustice of that entire system. And we know that it had these huge effects on equity. But all that's been shifting now. There are many, many who still believe the law and order narrative, but now there's a competing narrative that's gaining traction, that's more justice oriented, and that focuses on the extensive harms that the current system has had and on the dignity that all people deserve. How did the shift happen? It started with the Black Lives Matter hashtag, which you can see in this graph on the left, took off around mid-2014. Went viral on social media along with videos, and then online and on the ground organizing, huge mass protests around the country, music and art that reflected those values. We had investigations and trials. We had lots of statements and speeches by elected officials. We had huge amounts of media coverage, and all of that fundamentally shifted the way millions of people across the country thought about policing and justice. And more broadly, it changed people's dominant narratives about the need for racial equity. On the right, there's a graph from Pew, a survey by Pew, that shows that people basically, after the Black Lives Matter hashtag took off, after all of these things that I mentioned, started understanding the need to make deeper changes for racial equity. And all of that has now shifted the policy landscape. Many, and many we'll see, have structural impacts as well. We're now talking about police accountability across the country, and many jurisdictions are passing police reforms. We're now talking about things like defunding the police. Regardless of what you think of that in particular, that was just not a conversation that could have happened under the old set of narratives 5 years ago.
Right, right. And I will promise you, I know that it's a little tough to read this, but because we do have a PDF of the slides, you can really look at those images a little bit more closely later when you get your PDF. Selma's already sent you a link to the PDFs with the slides. But yeah, I hear you, Jonathan. With that, I do want to issue a disclaimer that county health rankings and roadmaps neither does match. We don't take positions on any issue that may be or part of a policy debate or maybe entering the policy debate, including things like defunding the police. However, I will reiterate your primary point, Jonathan, which is we weren't even talking about that. That wasn't even on the radar of conversation 5 years ago. So it shows how narrative can bring things even into a policy debate. And
Absolutely.
so I see what you're saying there. And is there a set of dominant narratives that have been responsible for limiting progress on racial justice and health equity?
Yeah, absolutely. Starting in the 1970s, a set of narratives that advance a very particular agenda, which many would call neoliberalism, there are other terms people would use, became dominant. And it was part of an explicit political strategy. The themes as shown on the slide are anti-government, free markets, individualism, and it's all kind of bound together with a bunch of racism and patriarchy. It was about how government should be small and get out of the way of free markets, and markets should be deregulated. It was about pulling yourself up by your bootstraps. Scarcity was a big part of it. Austerity. We don't really have funding for social programs. And there was also a denial that racism existed, including structural racism, and racism in these narratives was used intentionally to divide folks, as was patriarchy. Politicians worked on these narratives, perfected them, and we've heard things over the years like the 9 scariest words in the English language are, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help you," We've heard terms like welfare queens. We've heard super predators. Those all are messaging that to support these narratives. And then those narratives have had implications. They've led to policy changes like tax cuts for the rich, cuts to our social welfare programs, deregulation of business. And that has all led to huge health and racial inequities over the years. Until recently, I would say it was really, really hard to win any change that would advance equity because the majority of Americans really kind of deeply held these narratives. Equity advocates were always fighting an uphill battle against that public opinion, but it's starting to change. An alternative narrative is emerging. Through COVID, we've seen things like narratives around how our fates are tied together. We've seen racial inequity being challenged, as I mentioned before, and with all the policing. And that has had a big effect. I think things are starting to change.
Right. And I mean, just like what Dr. Fauci is saying, we can't deny racism's contribution to inequities that we see happening today. And what we're looking at this on the screen is an actual process. We can transform narratives. Tell us about how you do that.
Yeah, so I let me emphasize that this is work that we all can do. And I'll describe this process, a process that we've used in many places around different issues like criminal justice reform, taxes, voting, health equity, and Paula will talk a little bit more about that. And descriptions of these processes are linked in the examples at the bottom, which is also in the resources that we're sharing later on. So the process is really to bring together a set of health equity minded allies, your allies, and start by having conversations, I should say, I want to explicitly say that that should be inclusive of folks who have been most impacted by inequities. With that group, start a conversation about shared values and beliefs. All of this stuff is grounded in our values and beliefs. And so we need to start there and build trust. After you do that, I think you can start talking about narrative in the way we're talking about it here, define it, discuss what it means, discuss how it's a form of power. And then it's super informative, helps people really understand this if you then unmask current dominant narratives like the ones we were just talking about on the previous slides, and talk about how those are barriers to the progress that we all want to make around equity. Once you've done that, you can start discussing transformative narratives and then develop that into a one-pager folks can use not only for communications, but broadly in all of their work.
Yeah. And you did mention that those examples are in your resource guide. So, Jonathan, thank you for helping us to understand what a narrative is and the power that they hold, right? And how, but we don't have to stay stuck in something that's dominant and hurtful and obstructive. We can transform them. So I appreciate you with setting the stage for this continued discussion. And before we move on, I want to ask our audience, what narratives are you aware of that have been an obstacle to health for some? And I'm going to ask that you place your response in the chat. And if we have time, I will circle back to Selma for you to list some of those up, Selma. But one of the words that has permeated our narratives, at least lately, when we talk about health, is the word equity. Now, that word has reshaped how we think about resources needed for people to achieve their highest level of health. And one of the places where equity found its way into health dialogues was in Louisville, Kentucky. And we're fortunate today to have T. Gonzales talk to us about equity's journey from a concept to action. So T, what are we looking at here in beautiful Louisville, Kentucky? Tell us.
Well, you're looking at the Big Four Bridge, which is near the Louisville waterfront, which sits on the Ohio River. So it's actually a former railroad truss bridge. And it actually crosses over the Ohio River, and it connects Louisville side to the Jeffersonville, Indiana side. And it was actually converted in 2014 to a bicycle and pedestrian bridge. So if you're ever in Louisville, we invite anyone to come and take a walk or a bike ride across the Big Four Bridge there.
Nice. I'm afraid of heights, but I tell you, that is so beautiful. I might have to put that fear aside and actually walk across that bridge when I come visit you in Louisville. But anyway, welcome back. And I know that Louisville as a community, it's known for its longtime efforts around health and equity. And the establishment for the Center of Health Equity was an important milestone for you all. So give our audience a bit of a background about the center.
Yeah, so we're actually celebrating our 15th year anniversary here this month. We were established in June of 2006 by Dr. Adewale Troutman, who some may know is a giant in the world of public health. And Dr. Troutman established the center really at a time where we were trying to, as part of a paradigm change that was happening within public health. And we had to move from thinking about how health happens as just individual behavior and choices to really focusing on those root causes of health, specifically thinking about the ways in which racism impacts health. So he envisioned that we would be working for health equity through social justice. And so today we're trying to do that through public policies and partnerships and community engagement and looking at how we use our data.
Right. And before we can even think about like transforming a narrative, we know it's important to have a clear and shared definition of the term equity. So how did the center work with the community to do this, to actually have that definition that's shared?
Yeah, I think, understanding where our community and our society are is important in thinking about health. I think we want to make sure that everybody's kind of working towards the same thing, right? Health equity. But in order to do that, we have to make sure everybody understands from the same perspective of how health even happens. So in Louisville, health equity means that everybody has a fair and just opportunity to be healthy and reach their full human potential. And we understand that health is happening. We have the health outcomes. If you're looking at this tree here, many of you may be familiar with this kind of analogy, looking at the leaves of the trees as our health outcomes. So things like heart disease or diabetes, but we need to go into the roots because our health doesn't start in the leaves, right? So looking at things like transportation and education and so on and so forth. But we've taken that a step further. We want to make sure that we're understanding that everybody is experiencing those root causes of health. And the condition, though, that we find ourselves experiencing those roots of the health are really found in the soil. What is the soil made up of? And we find systems of power, things like racism and sexism and homophobia and transphobia, all mixed into the soil there. So depending on how we're experiencing those systems of power, also then shapes what we're finding in the roots. And so we want to make sure that who we engage with, our community partners, but also decision makers, even elected officials, are understanding the way in which health happens, so that we can all work towards strategies that will advance health equity.
Yeah, and this analogy just makes so much sense to me because I like to garden, and well, actually, my husband does the gardening, and I do the harvesting. I don't want to get my hands dirty, but anyway, it makes so much sense to me because we've got like areas in our garden that the plants and stuff are just not thriving as much as other areas, and so we can clearly see that there are certain parts of the soil that's more rich with nutrients that give it a better chance to thrive, and flourish. So that just makes so much sense to me. So, but I see that there is a report here that you got on this slide, and I want to let our audience know that we have a link to that report in your resource guide, so you can read all about Louisville's health equity report and how it came about. Now that equity is part of that narrative in Louisville, what equity-centered messages do you ensure that decision makers and policymakers understand as they do their work?
So some of this we had to ask ourselves. Again, we're 15 years old this year. So before the center was even established, some of what we had to consider is you know, how does our community currently understand how health happens and what health is about, right? So what was the message that those decision makers, elected officials, our community was getting about health before the center and working really an equity strategy? And a lot of that is what you might expect, because it's still a dominant narrative that it's really about individual behavior, it's about individual choice, and not the complexity that we understand in terms of those root causes of health and systems of power. So we've had to transform that, right? And some of how we've done that is reiterating some of these messages that you're seeing thousands and thousands of times across our community, so that we can get everyone, again, kind of pointed in the same direction. So the first is that health is more than healthcare, right? Often we think health is hey, go to the doctor, right? Well, the reality is that while healthcare systems are one part of how health happens, it's really more complex when we talk about those root causes of health. Right. The next is that health inequities are neither natural nor inevitable. And what we mean by this is that they're not natural. It's actually that it's not something that just happens, is occurring naturally in our environment, but that's actually created by humans, right? There's decisions, policy decisions, systems decisions that we are making as humans that create certain outcomes, and that they're not inevitable. So the good news for us, despite the huge challenges we have in terms of achieving equity, is that we actually, these results are not inevitable. That means we can change them. So we just as we made steps to lead to certain outcomes, we can change our actions and we can get different outcomes. Next is that the choices we make are shaped by the choices that we have. So what does this mean? The reality is it right if you say, hey, eat better, get more exercise, these kinds of things, these choices may not actually be available to communities where they live. And so we have to then be focused on what is the environment change that we need to be making, so that different choices, a more expansive choices that promote health and wellness, are actually available to everyone. And finally, that racism imposes an added health burden. So much of what we've been talking about today, the ways in which that soil, the systems of power, actually impose a burden on what kinds of conditions that we might find those roots in. And we need to be able to then, as public health practitioners and advocates for equity, be able to address systemic racism anywhere that it is, so that we can promote better health and wellness in our community.
I love that. I love the fact that you have messages that are clear, concise, and that you say, we repeat these often, so everyone understands those messages and they get to be, it becomes baked in. I like that. So how is the center using equity-centered narratives to build and sustain an equitable future for Louisville?
Yeah, so I kind of think about our work in three major buckets. So the first thing is that right? So we first understand that we have to transform ourselves, which is what we have been working towards over these past 15 years. And we continue to do that as we bring on new staff, as we change our organizational structure, all of that we are transforming ourselves first in order to practice differently. Our public health work has had to transform. And so we do that first within in order to advance equity within our community. Next is we focus outwards, right? And so a lot of this is the importance, many of you I know will share feeling the importance of partnerships, connection to your residents wherever you're living, especially if you're working within government. How do we make those connections outwardly in order, and then also helping to inform other people's strategies and practice, so that we're all kind of working in the same direction. And then finally, I work for Louisville Metro government. I'm a part of a large government institution. I work for a specific agency, but there are many agencies across Louisville Metro government. So we work with those other agencies, because I'm not a parks expert or a public works expert, but we need parks and public works to also be thinking about equity strategies. in order to transform how our entire government is working. So we know that we have to be focused on in all of these different areas, bringing those same messages to everyone in order to really kind of see the change that we're trying to create within our community.
Yeah, I love this. I love those 3 buckets that you have because it makes me think of the mantra that change starts with me. So, you want to do that inside work, clean up your house before you then take a message outside of it. And then I love the fact the with bucket because no matter where we sit, no matter what organization we're with, no matter what sector we work in, no matter what community we live in, there are opportunities to advance equity. And so we should be thinking about what is our role in making sure that everyone has a chance to be healthy. So thank you so much, T, and just hang in there because I know there are questions that people may have for you. But right now, Paula Trans, I want to bring you back to the mic. And just as we saw equity taking root in Louisville, it's now has become part of a core to health rather across the United States, including Wisconsin, where I see all these beautiful pictures. So Paula, can you describe the narrative work that you've been a part of in Wisconsin and how does that fit within your broader work to advance health and equity and racial justice?
Thanks so much, Erica. And also just want to commend folks for the engagement in the chat. I'm feeling y'all, and hopefully some of what I will talk about will continue the spurring conversation. So to answer your question, first I need to say that similar to what T described, there has been decades of leaders that have really paved the way for us. So really want to acknowledge all the sort of shoulders of giants that we are standing on, and also need to take a step back to just give you some background and start out with a little bit of a story. I really first learned about narrative and transformation of narratives when I started learning about power building. And that was really out of survival. About 10 years ago, we experienced in Wisconsin a pretty abrupt change in our administration, in our executive leadership. And so that was a moment for me where I had to sort of pause and take stock because that change was not just abrupt for me, but also for our field of public health in Wisconsin, and one that I don't think we were appropriately prepared for or really saw coming, even though in retrospect, based on how Jonathan describes our political history, should have been something we could predict. Because as nationally, we've seen greater movement towards amplifying narratives around shrinking government, shrinking investments and credibility in the public sector, which we saw incredibly exacerbated over COVID-19, and this sort of mantra of bootstraps individualism, using sort of a racist set of stories and ideals to really stoke that fire. And Wisconsin was not exempt from that sort of path and trajectory towards really operationalizing those dominant narratives. So when our change in administration happened, which was a part of this overall national and really global strategy around neoliberalism, many of us were left sort of dumbfounded at what to do. What was historically a strong centralized public health system with certainly lots of local control became pretty hamstrung in terms of our capacity to do work, that our websites and our policies became scrubbed of words like health equity and climate change. And so as a new public health professional at the time, I felt really defeated and powerless. And as I started talking to other public health folks, there really was no plan for us to find an organized, shared voice to really amplify not just what was our own self-interest as a field, but our field's mission, which was to promote and protect health. So I started literally Googling, because I did not learn this in public health school, how we move influence and power, and how do we build the influence of a Wisconsin public health community, and really stumbled upon grassroots community power building groups. And that's where I learned about power mapping, strategizing to build influence, really being deliberate in anticipating these shifts, and also the role of narrative in creating possibility. So when I joined the Population Health Institute, 4 years ago wanted us to really lean into our role as an academic public health institution, and began to deliver training and technical assistance around the connection between power building and health equity, started conducting engaged research on the social determinants of health in partnership with community organizers, and then began convening to support statewide alignment and priority setting. And that's really where some of our early narrative work came into play.
Yeah, I just want to pause you for a second, because you shared a story that may resonate with some of our audience members. You know, just because we get up here every month and talk about equity and the need to create it doesn't mean it's easy. It doesn't mean that you don't have obstacles. And I really appreciate you just sharing your experience, because I personally think that's the experience that a lot of people have. They are really struggling with this. And so it's important for our audience to know that we're no different. You know, we also often have to find our way to create equitable solutions. And so I know that you actually took that step of convening a group of equity-minded allies that Jonathan was talking about in this process of transforming narratives. And I want to really get into that conversation you have about the dominant narratives and that you're going to talk about. But I want to just get our audience to look at this slide, because what we see here are nuggets or you know, like elements of creating an inclusive statewide meeting. You've got multi-sectors. You've got geographic distribution that's varied, urban versus rural, and influential stakeholders who can help influence and transform a narrative. So those are the things that you want to think about when you think about bringing folks together, right, Paula?
Yeah, thanks, Erica. And just to draw the line closer, narrative is nothing without power, and power is nothing without narrative, right? And I think in Wisconsin, our own experience really amplified that with our political shifts, that, you know, because of some policies that were being dismantled with our new leadership, we saw 100,000 people come out to our Capitol every day for almost 2 weeks in Wisconsin winter, and it didn't make a difference, right? So this was also one of the first times where I experienced people power not being enough. And so that we understand power is complicated, and whoever wins the narrative at the end of the day can do a whole lot by way of moving policies and systems, right? And so we brought these folks together, and I will say we didn't do it perfect. We certainly should have had more people who are directly impacted by inequities at the table. We didn't know how to do that in an authentic way without creating harm. So I will say the journey towards that first step of convening a group of equity-minded allies, really important, and there are trade-offs in the process. So how do you hold the process piece alongside the outcome so that we're continuously striving towards how we are thinking about advancing health equity together?
Right.
I'll also just mention, so here we're seeing the dominant narratives, as Jonathan described, that we as a group came up with. So what happened was we convened the stakeholders that you saw on the previous slide. We had about 80 people come to the table that were strategically selected through power mapping and relationship building. And our goal was not necessarily about narrative per se, it was about identifying shared health equity priorities across our state that were not issue specific, right? That we wanted a cross-cutting set of priorities. And so we identified centering leadership of those most impacted by inequity, building strong alliances, declaring racism a public health emergency, developing strong equity narratives, developing a health equity policy platform, and identifying ways we could support people in office to support health equity thinking. Lots of those priorities shifted over time, and they're all a part of narrative, right? All of those things are actions. Want to stress that narrative is not just about words. I hope that is a takeaway point. It's also about what we do, and all of these pieces come together to allow us to shape a broader narrative. So when we started leaning into that narrative work, you see on the previous slide, the dominant narratives are in alignment with what Jonathan described in a bigger picture, but this is what we sort of zeroed in specifically for Wisconsin. And then, as you can see on the next slide, we are, after identifying the dominant narratives, we identified these transformative narratives. They're not one-to-one, as you notice. It's not about refuting any particular dominant narrative, because those are also salient, which is why they're working. The goal is to really think about a shifted or transformed narrative that is also as salient, maybe even more salient, to lay the possibilities and groundwork for us to advance what is needed to have conversations about health equity policy and systems change. So these narratives were what we landed on as value statements that then create the foundation for a whole host of other set of strategic actions, messaging campaigns. So this forms the foundation, but these are not always the necessarily the exact words that we might use.
Yeah, that makes sense. So now that they've transformed, how have you used these transformed narratives? Like, what messages came out of it?
Yeah, so thanks, Erica. We had the opportunity, like many folks had during COVID-19. We were asked to join our state response to support a community resilience and response task force. And you can find more information on our website. But we use these foundational values, these narratives, to create talking points, but also strategies for things that our leadership and our response might consider. So we offered alternative communications other than that didn't buy into the dominant narrative. I think what we experience is the dominant narratives are so pervasive, as Jonathan said. When we're not careful, we might unintentionally stoke that dominant narrative, which is exactly what we saw happen across the nation. People talking about masks as if these are sort of individual choices, when we know there are lots of equity issues around disabilities and racial equity for mask wearing. So we were able to, on the back end, infuse these narratives and thinking into both our strategies in our state response, as well as in our messaging. We, instead of saying things like, you need to wear a mask, we talked about things like, we don't need to choose between our health and our economy. Wearing masks actually helps our small businesses stay open during this time.
Nice.
So leaning on other narratives that we wanted to create collective, right, accountability for our response, instead of everyone viewing themselves as sort of lone rangers, which I think our governor did call us the Wild West after our state mandates were struck down. But I think our hope was to really offer an alternative way to that really amplified these narratives instead of the dominant narratives.
Well, I will, I know we're running short on time, but I do want to get you to talk about a little bit about challenges that you experienced in the process. And I do want to remind folks that Paula will be at the discussion group, so we can unpack a lot of what you're saying, which is such good stuff. But very quickly, one challenge and maybe one success that you had.
Yeah, I think our challenge was, if you look closely, or even not too closely, at our transformative narratives, they're pretty agnostic about racial inequity. And that's because when we define these narratives in 2017, it was a really different time in public health for how comfortable people were willing and how willing people were to talk about racial equity. So that is a critique, and it was a trade-off we made in order to create a foundation that allowed for our tent to be wide, right? Almost 5 years later, we know that these need to be revised to lean into talking more explicitly about racism, to continue to push on this moment and the public will that has been created around declaring racism a public health emergency. And you see here, our governor did say that out loud during the pandemic, that we are dealing with multiple public health emergencies. And so that was really exciting, and continues to be a challenge, right? That while we have come a long way around talking about racial equity, not all of us are talking about racial equity and power. And absent power analysis, lots of our strategies become pretty anemic around structural change. So there's still a whole lot of work to do, but we're really thrilled about the broader public will around saying these words out loud. We just need to really operationalize the actions so they're equally as meaningful.
And I know there's a couple of lessons that I really want folks to make sure you take a look at. Paula, why don't you just pick out one that kind of just really is important to you about a lesson learned with this work?
Yeah, I mean, again, it's about power, which means there's going to be tension and it needs to be relational. We are dealing with this every day, and we are messing up every day. So I think the container that needs to be built to be open, honest, transparent, vulnerable, and committed to these partnerships is so necessary because you will mess up if you're doing it right. And so that has been a huge lesson, and really, as someone who manages staff, how you take care of each other and take care of folks have been all challenging things. I think one last thing I'll sneak in is that there are multiple truths. These dominant narratives are not necessarily false, right? So I think getting ourselves out of the mindset of disproving or refuting or drumming enough facts in order for those dominant narratives to become false is not the way to go, right? What we're talking about is getting strategic about who we're in relationship with, and that needs to be with people who are impacted by inequity and building our collective power to make change.
Thank you so much, Paula. And I love this one about, you said it earlier, it's not about rebuttals. It's about creating a narrative that actually is inclusive and moves people forward. So I want to, I actually thank you so much for joining our panel today. And for those of you out there, I just curious about how your understanding of how narratives can be transformed has increased. So I'm asking James to launch a poll for us. This is an anonymous poll. We're not even going to share the results with you, and we don't know what your response is. But if you would be willing to just let us know how your understanding of narratives can be transformed has increased, let us know. And James, if you'll just leave that up for about 10 more seconds or so, I would appreciate it. I hope you all are feeling inspired to take action now, but you may be thinking like, where do I begin? I want to encourage you to consider our CHR&R's action learning guides that are equity focused. This is a good starting place, and these guides blend guidance tools and hands-on practice to support you in deepening your learning about equity. And a link to those guides will be included in your customized webinar resource guide that's going to be emailed to you tomorrow. I don't know if we have time for questions. Joanne, can we do one question? I'm like a child begging. Can we do one?
I actually have more than one question, but yes, you're the timekeeper, so we have time for one question.
Let's do one.
Perfect. And I'm going to pick this one and pitch it to T, because we got several questions along the same theme. And T, you really did such a nice job of explaining, how things really unfolded in Louisville. And I think folks are really interested to hear what advice you might have for co-creating narrative across a community that holds distinct and discordant perspectives.
Yeah, I think so. I will say, in the lead up to some of those key points that I mentioned earlier. So before the center was even established, there were many conversations happening within the community. I'm forgetting the name of some research that was done within our community. There was research done to see actually how our community members were understanding health and how it happens, and who's responsible for health, and what can be done to improve health in communities. So some of that has happened. And then, if you go to visit our health equity report at healthequityreport.com, the messaging there is used in order to inform the type of, in part, how the action that we should take as a community. So if that's organizational action, community level action, or public policy, we use that framing in order to drive what action steps we should take. And at this point, typically we would have put a report out last year, but pandemic. So we hope to put one out, our next health equity report at the end of this year. But we are working in close alignment with our community advisory board, with a whole, a huge group of community partners and residents in order to move from the framework of how we're thinking about health and all those things about choice and behaviors and all of that, and moving that into then what's a vision for our community. But
Right.
that all happens in close alignment with our community and envisioning together what that can be. And again, that comes with some action steps.
Yeah, so good way to reinforce the point, T, that creating transformative narratives is part of a broad effort with multi-components. And also the second important point is always stay in good ongoing communication with everyone in the community. Thank you. Erica?
Yeah, and thank you, Joanne. And we look forward to seeing you in the discussion group. Joanne's getting ready to head over right there, right now, and open up that room. So hopefully you all will be joining us as well in the discussion group. Right now, Selma is actually chatting a link to a feedback survey. I'm going to ask that you open up that survey and work on it a little bit later, but please know that we do take your feedback seriously. It's one of the ways that we're able to give you the content that you're looking for. So we appreciate if you would respond to that survey when you have some time. And again, I just want to mention to you that this webinar was the second. Originally, it was supposed to be the last, but it was the second in our Advancing Racial Equity series. But I am excited to announce that due to the overwhelming response from you all, our audience, we have decided to extend this service, this series rather, by one more webinar. And so in July, we will feature two veteran equity champions, Dr. Francisco C. and Dr. Simona Kwan, who are going to be exploring Asian American and Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander identity and health equity. So I hope that you are planning to join us for that webinar. We have a presence on Facebook and Twitter. The best way, however, to learn about what it is that we are doing is to sign up for our newsletter. So please make sure that whenever you are have the on our website, that you use that contact us button or the get help button, and also sign up for our newsletter. And using that contact us button will also put you in a way of connect you, rather, is what I'm trying to crank out. It will also connect you with a team member. So if you are thinking about how do I take steps to advance racial equity, but you're just not quite sure, or you're looking at a tool, but you want to think it through, feel free to reach out to us by contacting us, and know that we are always delighted to help you think through that and be a thought partner with you. And for those of you who are able, I want you to think about joining this discussion group. We have a lot to unpack today. These conversations give you that face-to-face opportunity to be with other webinar attendees, as well as chat with our guests. So Selma is sending out the link right now for that discussion group. It takes you about 30 seconds to sign up for it, and then you'll be linked into the discussion group. So I want to take a moment to thank T, Paula, and Jonathan so much for their information that they so willingly shared. And to my production team, thank you so much, James, Selma, and Joanne. And to you, the audience, thank you for all that you do. This work is not easy, and we certainly appreciate what you do to make this world a better place. And I will see you all next month, and see some of you in a discussion group. So have a good afternoon. Bye-bye.